In the Zohar on this week, in this week's parsha, on the pasuk V'Avram Zokein Bo Bayomim, the Zohar explains that by tzaddikim, the way it works is that they gradually work their way up day by day in getting closer to Hashem, connecting to Hashem. And that is the meaning of Bo Bayomim, Avram coming with all of his days. The special advantage of a Baal Tshuva is that he could do this in a much shorter amount of time. And the Zohar uses three expressions. B'shait achada, in 1 hour, b'yoyim achada, in 1 day, or even b'riga achada, which would mean like 1 second. They become close to Hashem. So in Lekutei Levi Yitzchak, the Rebbe's father asks that seemingly the order should have been a different order. First you start off saying that they could become close to Hashem, they could do tshuva in a day. And then you would continue in saying, and not only that, but even an hour. And then you would say, not only that, but even in 1 second. So why does it go in the order of first saying an hour, then a day, and then a second? Furthermore, once you say a second is enough, then there's no point even in saying that tshuva could be done in an hour or in a day. So the Rebbe's father explains that really we're speaking about 3 different levels of tshuva. This is based on a Lekutei Torah, where the Alter Rebbe explains that there are 3 levels in tshuva. There's the tshuva of sur meirah, staying away from bad. This level of tshuva reaches the lowest sphira malchus. There's the tshuva of asay tov, of doing positive, which reaches in a higher place, in the spherois of zaz, eirankman. These are the midos, chesed, gvura, etc. And finally, it says sur meirah, asay tov, then it says bakei shalom. This refers to the idea of learning Torah, and this reaches in the higher level, in the level of bina. And therefore, the Rebbe's father explains that these 3 levels that the Zohar refers to, and in this order, goes exactly in this order, milmato l'maylo, going from the lowest to the highest. Because generally, Sha'ah, Kabbalistically, is related to the Sphira of Malchus, so that would correspond to that lowest level of Tshuva, the Sur Meirah, which reaches Malchus. Yoima, the level of Yoim is connected with the Spherois of Zav, the Midos, Chesed, etc., and that it's called Yoim, and therefore this is the second level up, the level of Sur Meirah. And finally, the highest level is the level of Rega, which corresponds to the Sphira of Bina, which corresponds to the Avodah of Limud HaTorah, and that's why this one is mentioned last. Now, at first glance, it seems like the Rebbe's father is explaining that these titles that we have for different amounts of time is referring to particular Spherois, and that's why it fits very much with the order of the Spherois. But the Rebbe asks that seemingly it also has to fit with the simple understanding of these words, Sha'ah, Yoim, and Rega, that it's also referring to a specific frame of time. And therefore, the question becomes, says the Rebbe. In other words, first of all, we want to see how it fits with this idea of the time, but the Rebbe says what we need to understand is the fact that tshuva causes a person that he could immediately become connected to Hashem. This is connected with the general idea of where the whole tshuva is coming from. In other words, the mode within the nefesh, the part within the nefesh that's involved in tshuva, is that kind of level of the nefesh of the soul that's completely higher than any order, etc. And therefore the person could jump from one extreme to the other, on the one hand being so distant from Hashem one instant, and then becoming so close to Hashem. And this is why usually we say, because it's coming from such a deep level of our soul that's higher than any limitations and not restricted, that's why it can be done so quickly. But if that's the case, you would think the higher the tshuva is, the deeper of the nefesh it's coming from, the quicker it should be able to be achieved. If that's the case, so let's look at these 2 lowest levels of tshuva. The highest level of tshuva, we said, is beriga chada in 1 second. So that's bina, very nice. But the lower 2, the ones of asay sur meirah and asay toiv, so the question is then, why is the tshuva of asay toiv, which is a higher level of tshuva, and therefore seemingly in a higher place of the nefesh, why is that a longer period of time? That's the one that's a day, versus the lower one, sur meirah, that takes an hour. Also in the Spherois, the Rebbe says we need to understand, how is it that Zah, the Midos, which is higher than Malchus, and therefore seemingly more removed from the concept of time and space, why is that a longer period of time? That's a day versus Malchus, which is just an hour. Seemingly, again, it should be the other way around. The higher, the more removed it is, it should be removed and less involved with time, and therefore taking up less time. In order to understand this, says the Rebbe, that when we look at the general idea of, in an intellectual concept, what's greater, what's higher, when we are more brief and bekitzur, or when we have more arichos, more elaboration. So seemingly we find each one has its own place or its own advantage. On the one hand, we know the Mishnah is written much briefer than the Gemara. The Mishnah is written very, very shortly, very brief, and includes many, many things, as opposed to the Gemara, which writes out everything with great arichos. We know the Rishonim compared to the Acharonim. The Rishonim write much more bekitzer, much more brief compared to the Acharonim. In other words, the reason for this is because when we speak about a logical idea, a svara, as it's higher up in its source, it's going to be much more brief. When we need to bring it down to someone that's not on the level to be able to understand it, to the recipient, we need to elaborate much more. So that's on the one hand. It seems being brief is on a greater and higher level. On the other hand, we know it says a person should always teach his Talmud, a student, b'derech tzara, in a short form, in a short way. And simply the reason is because the Talmud is not going to be able to get the whole length and breadth and all the depth and all the details. So we only give him some short points of it. Now it sounds like being in having more details sounds like being higher than giving only over brief to the Talmud. So how do we understand these two ideas? So the Rebbe says the explanation is it depends what we're talking about. If we're speaking about two completely different worlds, two different realms within intellect, that one is completely higher than the other, then the higher one is going to be much more bekitzer. The higher one is going to be much more brief, because that's where you have the very essence of the idea. You immediately see with clarity the point, and therefore there's no need for arichos. When you want to draw it down, bring it down to a lower place in a world which can't relate really to these deep ideas, you need to have more arichos, more elaboration to explain it. But when we're speaking in one world, so to speak, in other words, within generally one realm, so here it's actually going to work the other way around. That a deeper idea is going to need much more words, much more explanation in order to be able to understand it. Whereas for something very simple, a few words should suffice. And the Rebbe again looks at examples. So the Rebbe looks at Mishnah versus Gemara. So again, because Mishnah is at a completely higher world, so to speak, than Gemara, Mishnah is going to be very brief and the Gemara is going to be with much more details. But if you look in the world of Gemara itself, clearly ideas that are much deeper are going to need much more arichos, much more discussion than something that's a very simple idea that you could just give over in a very, very simple way. Applying this back now to the idea of tshuva. Although we spoke about three kinds of tshuva, sur meira, asei toiv, and limud Torah, bakesh shalom, really it can be divided into two groups and like two different worlds. There's tshuva tata, the lower form of tshuva. This is like the world of action. It includes the two types of sur meira, asei toiv. They're both within action, staying away from a bad action or doing a good action. And then we have tshuva ilah. This is like a completely different world, the world of intellect, the world of Torah. And therefore, in this higher world, in the world of Torah, in the world of Bina, tshuva ilah, here, what's enough is even a tiny little amount, the greatest kitzur. Because in this higher world, there's no need for arichos. It's clear. Whereas when we come to the two lower tshuvos, so to speak, in the lower world, within the world of action itself, sur meira asei toiv, here it's actually going to work the other way around. That the higher one is going to be more barichos, is going to take more time. Like in the Gemara, when you have a deeper svara, a greater svara, it's going to be longer. And the lower one is going to be briefer. And the Rebbe says, even simply it works like that with sur meira and asei toiv. That asei toiv in the world of doing actions is clearly going to take longer than sur meira, than staying away, holding yourself back from not doing something. The Rebbe says the same thing is true in the spheros. Bina is on the level of intellect which is really higher than Olam, is higher than the worlds, and that's why that's the one that's called a rega, like 1 second. Because here Elikus is in the most revealed way, and therefore there's no need for time. And that's why it's a rega, 1 second. Whereas the next two levels, Midos and Malchus, both of them more connected to the worlds. Here there's more the concept of time already, and within them itself, again, Midos being higher than Malchus, therefore it's going to be like within Gemara itself, the deeper Svar is going to have more words. So Midos is going to be a longer period of time. The idea of Yoim, a day, versus Malchus, which is going to be just like a Shah, is going to be a Shah, is going to be like an hour. Says the Rebbe, according to this beer of the Rebbe's father, that these 3 times correspond to 3 levels of tshuva. Based on this, the Rebbe is going to explain now another version in the Zohar, the version of the Ramak, that actually has a 4th level, a 4th amount of time. It's called Zimna Chada. Zimna Chada means 1 time. How does this fit? How does this all work? So the Rebbe goes back to the Likutei Torah that we said that there was 3 levels of tshuva. But in the Likutei Torah it says that in truth there's a 4th level, a higher level that corresponds to the level of Chachma. In Avodas Hashem, this would be the Avodah when a person holds himself back even from permissible things. Kadesh Atzmach, make yourself holy, even in that which is permitted. So the Rebbe says this one is going to be connected to this 4th expression of Zimna Chada. Why is that? Rega, the word Rega we translate it as a second, but the word Rega means it's already a certain measurement of time. But Zimna Chada just means time without even describing any sort of measurement at all. So the Rebbe says like this. In Likutei Torah, again, it explains that these 2 levels, the 2 higher levels, are Chachma and Bina. Now, Chachma and Bina, we know, are called Terei and Rei in the Lamed Parsha. They never separate. And therefore, sometimes they could just be counted as one. That's why we usually count just 3 levels of tshuva, because again, Sur Meira Asei Tov, corresponding to Malchus and the Midos. And then we have the levels of Chachma and Bina, which really could often be just counted as one. But sometimes we do separate it as 2. Says the Rebbe, this is why the standard Girsa in the Zohar, we have the three expressions corresponding to the 3 regular levels of tshuva, 3 levels of tshuva. But since sometimes we do count also this 4th level corresponding to Chachma, says the Rebbe, this is why we also have this Girsa that counts Zimna Chada, which represents this 4th element of tshuva, which corresponds to Chachma, which is the ultimate level within tshuva itself.